1945年5月31号发生的台北大空袭事件。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？谁当家？
当家？我当家？你当家？我当家？
我当家？
到底谁当家？你来当家。
Welcome to the Residence Messenger program on Taipei Broadcasting Station. I'm your host, Ross Feingold. Today, our very special guest is Michael Hurst of the Taiwan POW Prisoner of War Camps Memorial Society. Michael, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Russ, for having me. I appreciate it. It's a real honor to be here.
Well, I think the honor is really ours because you're going to share with us a very important part of the history of Taiwan, although the period we're going to talk about was often referred to as Formosa and not Taiwan, and Taiwan or Formosa's role in the history of World War II. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Allied prisoners of war who the Japanese put into prison camps here on Taiwan. But before we get into that, Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be in Taiwan, and how you got interested in the POW camps history.
Well, it was back in 1986. I had an advertising company in Canada, and of course, in those days, everything was made in Taiwan. And so I came over here on a buying trip to try to find suppliers and buy products for my customers. Immediately fell in love with Taiwan and the people. I returned, was very successful in business and started off with some good connections. And then I came back every year to the trade shows and to see my suppliers again. And finally, in 1988, I saw some good business opportunities, and I thought, well, I'll stay here for 6 months to a year. And in the meantime, I had met a young lady who's now my wife, and the rest is history, as they say. But I was able to develop a small factory here in Taiwan producing promotion items and things, and eventually closed the business in Canada and stayed in Taiwan permanently. And I've been here 32 years now, so it's been a long, great time.
And your interest in the POW issue?
Well, the interest in the POWs... excuse me. The interest in things military started back when I was a boy. I had found out at a young age that I had quite a number of uncles and even some aunts who were involved in World War I and World War II. And having heard their stories and seen some pictures from the horrible trenches in France and Belgium and places like this, Gallipoli and other places, it really made me have a great respect for what they had done. They had volunteered and sacrificed to go over there. I had one uncle that was wounded 3 times, and they kept sending him back to the front. And so I determined, even as a young boy, that someday, in addition to going to Remembrance Day and wearing a poppy and all that, that I would try to do something tangible to say thank you to the veterans. And in 1996, we heard about the former Japanese prisoner of war camp in Chinguashi. And there was a Canadian doctor in the camp, Dr. Wheeler from Alberta. And he was called the man sent from God by the prisoners because he was a miracle worker. He saved hundreds of lives and operated on men with dental forceps and razor blades. It was really he was really a miracle worker. And anyway, I thought, well, this story is unknown. It's unknown here in Taiwan. And as I found out later, because the families and they told me that when their fathers and grandfathers went home from the war, they never talked about it. It was too horrific, and they couldn't share it with their families. And so for all these 75 years, a lot of the stories, families are still not knowing what happened to dad or granddad or their uncle.
And you mentioned a bit about some of your own family who had served in both World War I and World War II. Had they predominantly served in Europe, or did you also have relatives who served in the Pacific theater?
Well, Canada, being involved in the war as it was in both 1 and 2, was both mainly Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. But 1 year, back around 2000, I was doing a family tree study with some of my cousins in England and Canada and Australia, and I found out that I had 2 uncles, distant uncles, on my mother's side of the family who had been prisoners of war. They were captured in Singapore. They worked on the death railway in Thailand and Burma. And after the railway was finished, they were sent back to Singapore, put on a hell ship, and they were en route to Japan when the U.S. submarine Sea Lion torpedoed the ship, and they were both lost at sea. It was a tragedy. They were 27 years old. They were twin brothers, and they'd survived all through the war by looking out for each other And at the end, the John, the one brother's name, he was on some wreckage and he was approaching some other Australian and British mates, and they said, John, come on over. You can be safe. And he said, no, I got to find my brother Burke. And they were never seen again. And so it was in a way, I am related indirectly to Far East prisoners of war, which makes it a little more significant.
Let's talk a little bit about the Far East before the war. Was Taiwan, to your knowledge, important for Japan? Obviously, at the time the war started, Taiwan, Formosa, had already been a Japanese colony ever since 1895. But when the Japanese were planning to go south to attack the Philippines and Malaya and Singapore and Indonesia and to attack Pearl Harbor, what was the role of Formosa for the Japanese military at the time the war began?
Well, Taiwan at the time, of course, had been a Japanese colony, as you say, for quite a number of years. It was a very strong, secure military base. We had a lot of Navy, Air Force, and Army people here. Over 220,000 Taiwanese young men either volunteered or were conscripted to serve overseas. They had incredibly efficient squadrons of Air Force here. And it actually turned out that in the year preceding the war, the actual formulation of the plans for attacking Malaya and the Philippines and Singapore were all formulated here by one of the Japanese military intelligence groups that were based on Taiwan. It didn't happen in Tokyo, it happened here. So that makes very significant for Taiwan. And of course, when it did come time for the invasion of Malaya and Singapore and the Philippines, the initial Japanese fleet sailed from here via Indochina, Vietnam, around to attack Malaya and Singapore that way, and they came basically from Taiwan. And then, of course, the attacks on December the 8th on the Philippines were directly, the aircraft flew out of Kaohsiung and Tainan and Pingdong air bases, and the Japanese 11th Naval Fleet with all their airplanes and whatever, they all came out of Kaohsiung Harbor. And so yeah, the invasion of Malaysia was largely staged from Taiwan. So it was a very important base. And then later, because it was such a secure colony, the Japanese decided to they had a philosophy that if you took the senior officers away from the enlisted men couldn't function, which was quite true in their army, but it didn't work that way in our armies. And so they decided to move all the senior officers from Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, to Taiwan. And so we had all of those very important prisoners of war here. Some of the most famous World War II prisoners were right here in camps in Hualien and Baihe and Taipei.
We'll talk a little bit more in detail about those camps shortly, but let's shift a bit to the Allies. And so we talked about how Formosa was very important for Japanese military planning at the start of the war. But as the war changed and Japan went from a strong position to a weaker position, and as the Allies gained the upper hand around the region, whether coming from Hawaii, working their way west, or from India, working their way east in Burma, how did the Allies view Formosa? Some of the listeners may have seen the movie about MacArthur, where he goes to meet the president at the time and says, I want to invade the Philippines. And all the other generals and admirals wanted to invade Formosa, but the president of the United States agrees with MacArthur, and they decide to bypass Formosa. So what was the role of Formosa in the eyes of the Allies as the war progressed towards the end?
Well, from my limited knowledge and what I can think of is that Formosa was a big island, and invading Formosa all at once would have taken an incredible amount of military equipment, ships and planes, and an innumerable amount of men. And MacArthur was going to go to the Philippines anyway, but the idea was, did we go from there to Formosa and then to Okinawa and Iwo Jima? And MacArthur decided to bypass Taiwan. Admiral Nimitz wanted to take Taiwan, but again, in retrospect, it would have been an almost impossible feat to do, and it would have delayed the war and just taken months to get over this island. And but But from the time in the early fall, October, basically, of 1944, the Admiral Nimitz and the Navy were tasked with sending their carrier aircraft to bomb and strafe ports and harbors and industry and whatever all across the island of Taiwan. So they started on October the 12th doing that. And then the bombing, of course, continued on through the spring from the Navy carriers. They also, by that time, by the summer, they also had captured the Marianas Islands, Guam and Saipan and Tinian, and of course the Americans were bombing Japan with B-29s from there. They didn't bomb Taiwan very much, but they most of it was concentrated on the north area. And then, of course, once the Americans landed on the Philippines and had established good bases, they were able to send U.S. Army Air Force land-based bombers up here, and they just devastated the island.
What are some of the targets that were devastated by Allied bombing?
Well, one of the big targets early on was the Sun Moon Lake area, because they have huge power plants there, and it basically, the Sun Moon Lake power plant supplied a huge amount of power to the northern half of the island, and so they took those out as early as they could. And then, of course, there were the harbors. Kaohsiung and Keelung Harbor were very heavily bombed. And one of the prisoners of war had told me when they went, at the end of the war, they went back through Keelung to board the ships to leave the island, that there was hardly a building standing, that the town was just flattened by the incessant bombing that the Americans had done to the harbor. And, of course, the rail lines, and all through Hsinchu and down the west coast, Tainan. The airfields were all hit. Chiayi Airfield was a very important airfield, very close to one of the prison camps down there, and it was very, very heavily bombed. And
did the Japanese have strong anti-aircraft defenses at that point in the war?
Well, they did. They had a lot of them, but again, whether the American pilots were just skilled enough to evade them, but there were quite a number of American pilots that were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and as well as other fighter aircraft the Japanese sent up to intercept them.
Now, you mentioned that Japan decided to gather together more senior officers and bring them to prisoner of war camps here on Taiwan. When did that process begin?
Well, actually, they were the British were captured in February of 1942. The Hong Kong had already surrendered in December. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies went down in March, and the Philippines was in April and May. And so it was in the summer of 42 that once the Japanese got themselves and everything else kind of sorted out in these various areas and moving the men into major camps to start with, they realized that, well, maybe if we take away the senior officers, the chain of command will be broken and the men will just be usable by us. And like as I say, it didn't work that way. One of the prison war camps here down south in Dolio actually had a sergeant as the guy in charge of the camp because there were no officers. And so that's how it worked. But no, they sent them up in August of 1942, the General Wainwright and General King and Moore, the top generals from the States in the Philippines. And many brigadiers and colonels in the American Army were put on a ship and taken to Hualien at the start, and in 1st of September. And then about 2 weeks later, they brought the men from Singapore, and they were the head of the Dutch, British, and Australian armies. And the governors of all the conquered Asian colonies ended up here in camp at Karenko and in Hualien. And later on, a year later, they were moved to the camp near Baihe, and the top generals and the governors were moved to a camp that was located in Mucha, just down on Mucha Road. There's nothing left of it now. There's an apartment building sitting on it now. But
did that process continue throughout the war, as battles continued and officers may have been captured, say, 1943, 1944, even though the tide of the war was changing? Did that process of selecting senior officers, prisoners, and sending them to Formosa, did that continue throughout the war? It was only in that initial period when they took large numbers of prisoners that the Japanese did that.
No, it continued right through the war. I mean, they had they had first the highest ranking officers, then they had the lower ones, the majors, the captains, the lieutenants, and whatnot, and they brought them here along with a lot of enlisted men, basically to do slave work, to work in the mines at Kinkaseki, to down in Taichung. They were supposed to dig a flood diversion channel to keep the waters from knocking out the bridges down there. In Pingdong, the men had to gather rocks and stones off an abandoned river valley so sugarcane could be planted. It was terrible slave work. And here in Taipei, especially in the early stages, the Japanese, because they were winning the war, they decided to build a victory park just right here near the Grand Hotel. And so they employed the men from the camp in Daji to go and dig this lake by hand and transport the earth in push carts about a mile away. And it was really, and of course this is all based on a starvation diet, maybe less than 1,000 calories a day, when most normal working men would need 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day just to sustain. So they had that problem, and then of course they didn't really have any hospitals per se. The camp doctors had a hut that they used as a hospital. The Japanese provided very little medicine and equipment to them. So it was again the doctors who were the heroes. They saved the lives of hundreds of men in all of the camps. It was, but no, and through 43 and 44 they brought all kinds of men here, and just to finish off that point, in 44 particularly, and into 45, the Japanese started moving all the men who were in the Philippines and Taiwan towards Japan to get them away from the advancing armies. And so that changed the picture here. The senior officers went to Japan and then finally Manchuria in October of 1944. So they were right out of the picture until the end of the war.
Now you mentioned that in addition to military officers, there were also some colonial officials, governors. Different countries may have had different names for these officers, civilian officers, colonial officials. Were they brought here with their wives and their families?
No, they were treated just like prisoners of war. We basically, other than a few odds and ends of civilian men who were gathered up when all the white people were gathered up, for example, in the Philippines, they were maybe working for a local company, and they were just gathered up. We had no civilian camps in Taiwan, and no civilian women or anything like that. We had a handful when they were starting to move the men from the Philippines to Japan. Some of them were so badly treated on the ships that they had to offload in Taiwan for a couple of months to get fit before they could continue their journey. And in that group there were half a dozen or so American civilians, and there was some Dutch, Norwegian, Czech, and they eventually all went on to Japan.
You mentioned some of the nationalities, but can you share with us a bit more specifically over the course of the war and the prisoners who were held here in camps on Taiwan? Give us a breakdown of the nationalities.
Well, the biggest nationality, of course, was the British, and they had the most prisoners captured in the war over here. There was about 2,600 British on Taiwan. There was 1,553 Americans, and they were the second largest group. The Dutch had 156. The Australians had 55. Canadians had 3. The Australians had 55, as I say. The South Africans had 3 that were attached to the British Army, and there were a few Czechs and Norwegians, and 3 or 4 of them. So altogether, there was 4,372 Allied prisoners here.
And how do you know that with such specificity? Because my understanding is that as the war came to an end, the Japanese were destroying records, and then even after the national government came and accepted the Japanese surrender, the Kuomintang government, they also may have destroyed some records as well. So how do you have all this good information?
There was a number of records that weren't destroyed, and some of them were captured, and the Japanese, of course, did have to have some accountability after the war. And a lot of the records that were from this, including records of men who sailed on the hell ships and men who were in the camps, were eventually, archived in the National Archives in Washington or in the National Archives in Kew in London, and a few other places. But they were classified for like 50 years, so they were just, to prior researchers back in the 80s and 90s, they just weren't available. Fortunately, they were declassified, and we've been able to tap into them. But it took me, there was a list of men made of the Kinkaseki camp in Chinguashi, and there was a list of men made for the camp in Dolio. And that was all I had to start with. That was about 1,400. And all of the rest of the men that I found to be prisoners of war in Taiwan, it took me 14 years before I finally completed the list. And it was through, diaries and letters. Somebody would say, well, John Smith was my bunkmate. Well, they didn't have John, so put him in the list. And just one by one, later on, as some things became declassified, particularly like hell ship rosters, where they had maybe 250 or 500 men on a ship going to Japan, they would have the list of the men who arrived in Japan but they'd come from Taiwan. Well, if they'd arrived in Japan from Taiwan, they had to have been on Taiwan. So I could add those in, again, in bulk. And so it was sometimes the list built rather quickly. But in the end, we've done that. I have a lot of amendments to my records. Some men who we thought were here weren't, and things like that. But we finally sort of settled it down. But it took a long time. I've been doing this for 23 years now. So in that time, you get a lot of information. One of the other things that's been very special and probably the most useful is the POWs themselves and their families have given me diaries. Either the original diaries kept in little Japanese school notebooks written in pencil, hardly readable, some of them. Other ones are transcriptions of those kind of diaries, are photocopies of diaries. And by having the men's diaries all alone, because I've had wonderful help from researchers in the States who've gone to the National Archives and
foreign governments like the U.S. or the U.K. might have, or the Taiwan government. What about civilians from Taiwan, or were there any neutral nationals on Formosa at the time who may have interacted with the prisoners, provided them food or any medical care that the Japanese might have allowed them to do? Did you ever come into contact with civilians or people in Taiwan who said, oh, my grandfather helped out or was an employee at the camp, or as I said, any neutral country nationals?
You're talking about Taiwanese people. Well, no, there weren't really, and of a lot of the Taiwanese people we've talked to, like even out, chaps who worked in the mine out in Kankaseki, they were just too afraid of the Japanese to go and interact with the prisoners very much. And one of the wonderful things, though, that I often tell people is that, as I said, the Taiwanese were very sympathetic. When the men had to march through the city to go to their camp, and they were all filthy and wet off the ship and had dysentery, and the Japanese would line up the people, the prisoners have said repeatedly they didn't see hatred or anything, animosity in the eyes of the local Taiwanese. They saw sympathy and sadness. And there were wonderful cases where, like in the mine at Kankaseki, for example, some of the miners would take a little piece of their battered pork and pass it to the prisoners, because they all kind of ate lunch in the same area. And the prisoners, all they had was like 2 baseball-sized balls of rice to eat for lunch, maybe a little seaweed on top, in a little wooden box, bento box. And I've even wondered sometimes if the man didn't go home from work and noticing the plight of the prisoners and say to his wife, put an extra pork chop in the box for me. And they did. They did try to give them some food, and other places in Taiwan they also tried to help out, and they'd give them thumbs up. They'd give them cigarettes if they could sneak them to them and things like that. So.
And what about the camp guards? Were those mostly Japanese, or were there Koreans?
Well, there were no
Taiwanese, Aboriginals.
Well, no, the Aboriginal Taiwanese didn't, as far as I know, were never camp guards. I don't know that I'm aware of. Although there was 1 or 2 down in the south of Taiwan, the Pingpu people, who they were mixed, and they were prison guards. But most of the prison guards were about 30%, more like 60 or 70% were Taiwanese. But the other percentage, the lower percentage, were the Japanese. And, of course, they were the ones in charge, and they were the ones who told the Taiwanese to beat the prisoners and do this and do that. Unfortunately, some of the Taiwanese young lads didn't need any prompting, but other ones did their jobs very reluctantly and tried to help out and tried to treat the prisoners nice, and from the stories that I've heard.
Well, we're going to take a short break, but after we come back, we'll talk more about what people could see when they visit these sites around Taiwan. You're listening to Residence Messenger on the Taipei Broadcasting Station.
总在我家巷口和你分手，偶像剧一样，觉得我们就要发生些什么。总在回家时候不知所措，想再打电话给你，可是再见刚刚才说过，有一种想要拥抱你的冲动。想静静看着你的笑容，让你藏在怀中，直到我每天的尽头。 为想一个人而寂寞，因为爱一个人而温柔，因为有一个梦而执着，因为等一个人而折磨，因为想一个人而解脱，因为爱一个人而宽容，因为有一个梦而放纵，因为等一个人而漂泊。想要拥抱你的冲动，想静静看着你的笑容，让你藏在怀中，直到我每天的尽头。因为想一个人而寂寞，因为爱一个人而温柔，因为有一个梦而执着，因为等一个人而折磨，因为想一个人而解脱，因为爱一个人而宽容，因为有一个梦而放纵，因为等一个人而漂泊，因为想一个人而寂寞，因为爱一个人而温柔，像夜的朦胧，你的深情难懂我的世界，因为你而不同，因为想一个人而解脱，因为爱一个人而宽容，像风的自由，你的深情难留，你的背影是我最美丽的所有。
收听台北广播电台 FM 93.1 AM 1134，让你的心情嗨起来。大家好，我是陈零九。
亲爱的民众，108年度综合所得税结算申报从5月1号开始，请多加利用线上报税工具在家申报。如要前往国税局申报，请事先利用手机或电脑到各地区国税局网站进行线上取号，避开尖峰时段前往，降低武汉肺炎群聚感染风险，并请务必佩戴口罩及配合现场防疫措施。以上内容由财政部赋税署提供。
国军109年国防知信之旅营区开放活动期程已公布在国防部政战资讯服务网，欢迎民众上网查询。活动内容包含静态装备陈展、动态战技操演及国军人才招募等，请民众踊跃莅临参观。以上内容由国防部提供。
Welcome back to the Residence Messenger program on the Taipei Broadcasting Station with Ross Feingold. Our guest today is Michael Hurst of the Taiwan POW Camps Memorial Society. Michael, but before we talk about some of the specific locations and what people and visitors can see, why is this story, the story of the POWs in Taiwan, not as well known as POW stories in other locations around the Pacific theater of the war? I mean, there's movies about Thailand and Burma, of course, and Bridge Over the River Kwai being one of the more well-known ones, but there's movies about the experience of both civilians and military prisoners in Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, in the Philippines. There's numerous movies in China, of course. Why is this story not as well known?
Well, basically, when the men went home, they'd been through so much. It was just so horrific that they couldn't talk about. They couldn't talk about it. They wouldn't talk about it anywhere around their children because it would be horrifying. They couldn't talk about it really with their families. Unfortunately, the American and the British governments told them not to talk about it. And my personal view, which nobody's ever disagreed with me on, is that because the Americans had abandoned their armies in the Philippines and Churchill had sent 30,000 men to a useless end in the Singapore, that they didn't want it talked about when the men got home because that's not politically good for the governments at the time. But on the personal side, a lot of the men still wanted to talk about it, and they would talk about it with their girlfriends or their wives or their parents and whatever they would try to. And people, would say to them, like I'm talking to you, and I'm telling you this, and you're saying, "Oh, Michael, you got to be kidding! That couldn't be true." And as soon as they started to do that, the men shut down. If you, I'm trying to pour out my heart to you, and if you don't believe me, I've been through this, then I'm not going to talk about it anymore. And so they did that, and they were just so traumatized by it, really, that they didn't talk about it much. And it's only been, and then of course, around 1995, at the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, they started to, I think the media started to figure out, well, we better talk to some of these veterans and find out what they did in the war. And while they were talking to people who landed on the shores of Normandy or Iwo Jima or fought the Battle of the Bulge, they ran across Far East prisoners of war. Unknown. Who are you guys? What were you doing here? And then they started to tell their story, and it became more acceptable. And about that time in 96, as I said, I started to take up the story of Taiwan. A very close friend of mine in Thailand at the bridge on the River Kwai has built a wonderful museum there, and Rod has spent the same number of years, 23 years, telling the story of the prisoners there. Another lady in Borneo, and private individuals without any government help or whatever have tried to tell the story of the people in our area so that their story will be known to the world, and so it's been fortunate in the last 25 years that their story now has been told, and they're not forgotten. The thing they said to me was that they often felt that everybody, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was always well celebrated, and all the men who fought in the battles in Europe were heroes, and some of those men, of course, who captured the Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Indonesia were heroes here, but far more of them were prisoners than there were, and so they just felt that their lives and what had happened had been swept under the carpet, and that nobody wanted to know, and then they were going to be forgotten. And some died soon after they came home from the war, and others have died in the last 50, 60 years, and thinking that nobody cared, and nobody wanted to know their story, and that they would be forgotten. But thanks to, I think, our efforts to try to make this story known through the internet and things like this, and things through this program, the men now are going to their graves knowing that, no, we haven't been forgotten. And I think that's probably the greatest achievement and the best part of this whole story.
Now, tell us a bit about some of the efforts you've made to tell this story, and some of the locations and what people could see at those locations now when they visit them.
Well, as I say, I started in 1996, 97, and we, through the group of expatriates and whatnot here, we built the memorial in Kinkaseki in Chinguasha. And then from there on, I decided that, well, we can't just build a memorial here without trying to find the men who were prisoners in Taiwan and let them know what's been done in their honor. But the other committee were kind of dissolving and going their own way, people rotating out. And so the guy said to me, well, Michael, you do it. So I said, okay, I will. So I started writing letters all over the world looking for prisoners and all the continents. And they started to come in. And once the men knew that somebody was out there, a researcher, a young person, who was interested in their story, they opened up. And they've opened up to me like they've never opened up to their families. And so this is, I have a treasure house of things. And sometime I'm working on a book now, which I hope will be finished this summer, finally, that will tell the story of all the camps and the men from their quotations and their viewpoints. And then after that, I'm hoping we can get a museum, a Taiwan Prisoner of War museum going somewhere here in Taipei or New Taipei City, so that people can go and see the thousands of artifacts and things that I've collected. And so anyway, we started to explore. I have a wonderful group of fellows who work with me over the years on our little board of directors. And we've gone out and we found the locations of all 16 prison camps. There were 14 camps that were actually run by the Japanese as prison camps. And then when the war ended, the men who had been in Kinkaseki and had been transferred out into the hills south of Xingtian to a camp just to starve to death, were brought back into a camp which is located where the Mincheng Junior High School is now. Nothing, of course, remains. And the other men were brought from the camp near Baihe, and they were put here into the Taipei Soccer Stadium area, which was a Japanese, had formerly been a baseball stadium, and it was converted to a Japanese convalescent hospital. And it had been heavily bombed, but there were enough buildings left that the men from the camp could be in there. They were in those camps for about 10 days until the American and British navies came in and evacuated the men from here to Manila for hospital care and treatment, and then from there they went on their way home. And so that's kind of the way it was, and so let's say that the two camps that were run by the prisoners themselves were not, but in total there were 16.
And are there memorial plaques there now? What have you helped to
Well, what
to
we've
build
tried
at the
to do
locations?
on all the major camps, of course, there was the camp in Dazi here in Taipei. There was the camp in Qingguasha. That was the first one. There were also camps in Taichung and Pingdong and Kaohsiung and Dolio and Yuanlin. The ones in Dolio and Yuanlin, they were temporary to house mostly the American guys on their way through here to Japan, and so there were some British in that group as well. And then the one at Baihe, just outside of Chiayi, and we had the one in Mucha. So there were we placed memorials at most of the camps. We have one in Hualien and one in Taichung, Pingdong. We have the hell ships memorial that we did because the men all came here on these atrocious hell ships, jammed down in the hole with no food and water for a couple of weeks, and men died in them. It was just awful. So we have a hell ships memorial in Kaohsiung. And of course, we have one at the Ministry of National Defense headquarters here in Dazi, and the ones in Qingguasha. In 2011, we had a partial, the finishing and reconstruction of the park, which is formerly the site of the camp, the Kinkaseki camp in Qingguasha. And on that, we met with the New Taipei City government at the time, and we talked about how we could develop it further into a memorial park. And so we decided to erect a wall, and it's a 56-foot, 17-meter wall with the names of all 4,360-odd prisoners on it. And we have a sculpture there that we put up to try to show people the thin, emaciated men, half naked and barefoot, and this is what they look like, and to try to visualize. So Qingguasha has the most to see, and of course in the Gold Museum at Qingguasha, they've just had a recent renovation whereby they've enlarged our prisoner of war memorial display immensely. It's almost a third of the ground floor, and it's fabulous to tell the story of the prisoners. I'm very grateful to New Taipei City government for that. And so the story is being told, and I mean a lot of Taiwanese people are going through the museum and seeing it, and I meet them out in the field some places or at the camp when I'm out there, and they just say, we had no idea there was all this before, and and thank you for doing this and whatever. So there's most to see probably at Qingguasha. The other camps, Taichung and the camp at Baihe and Hualien, of course, there's memorials there, and they're available to the public. You can go up to them, you can see them. They're remotely located, though. In the case of there's no public transportation really available to get to them. But again, we'd be happy to answer inquiries about it and whatnot if people would care to write us on our website. But so
how do these memorials differ from similar prisoner of camp memorials around the region, or is a memorial because it's so somber and marking something so serious. Do they all look alike, or is it unique to Taiwan? Is there something special about these memorials that distinguish them?
Well, I'd like to think so, because there are some big war memorials around, and of course, the main war memorial we have in Qinghua was fairly big and cost a lot of money, with the wall, of course, and the other sculptures out there. But in the other camps, we've used green Taiwan marble. It's quarried near Hualien, and they all basically say the same thing: in memory of the men who were held in this so-and-so prisoner of war camp from so-and-so such and such, by the Japanese in World War II. We will remember them, and that's in English and Chinese. And the wording is the same on all the memorials, with the exception of the camp name. And they're all basically kind of a rounded top, flat bottom memorial set in concrete. And they not only serve as a memorial for those of us who know about it, but they also serve as a bit of a historical marker, which I think is why the government is pleased that we put them up. So this is a piece of World War II history here in Taiwan that people can actually see. And so the memorials are smaller, and they're simple. They're not huge and elaborate, but we think they do the job in letting people know. And of course, we get a lot of people from the UK and the States and Canada and Australia coming over here. The children now, of course, children and grandchildren.
Tell us a little bit about that. Where do you take them when they visit?
We'll take them. Depends what camps their father or their grandfather, their uncle was in, and touch the wall and see it. I'm very pleased with our wall in Qinghua, because it's much like the Vietnam Veterans Wall in Washington, where the wall is reflective black granite. And so when you're standing there in front of it, touching your father or your grandfather's name, you can see your reflection in the wall, and it has an effect of bringing you closer. And a lot of the families, they know what happened to their dad or their granddad, and of course, there was only 430, I say only, that died here in Taiwan. 10% of the prisoners that were here died. That's still an awful lot. But even those that go home, and the dads and granddads have passed on now, to go and to touch that name on the wall, and some of them have just knelt down and sat by the wall and had some quiet time with their dad or their granddad and whatnot, and so it means a lot to the people coming back, closure, and to actually walk in the footsteps of where their dad or their granddad was, who never talked about it. And so now, through our resources, we've been able to share that with them, and they've been able to actually be in the place. And so if they were in the camp in Baihe or in Hualien or whatever, we'll arrange transportation and whatever it takes to take them back to the camp if they want to go. So,
and tell us about some of the memorial events that occur on specific dates each year.
Well, our big one is what we call Remembrance Week, and our society's been putting that on since 1997. And we invite the former prisoners and their families to come back for a week of visiting the camps and having when the prisoners were here, we used to have a banquet in their honor on Saturday night. We have the big Remembrance Day service on Sunday back at Kinkaseki. It's an all-day event with a picnic lunch supplied by the Commonwealth and Allied Trade Offices, and so we can. That's our biggest event of the year. In August, the closest Saturday to August the 15th, and this year it will be August the 15th. We have what we call FIPO Day, Far East Prisoner of War Day, and we have a display of some of our museum artifacts that I've collected. We have a short memorial service, and then we show a World War II film on prisoners. And again, a lot of them are based on the River Kwai, because that's what everybody knows about. But some of the films are wonderfully done, and so again, people get to see visually, through the actors. And we usually choose pretty good films like The Railwayman or Unbroken, ones that have really done a good job on telling the story. So that we do that, and then in June, usually we have a small gathering at the old Taipei City Prison Wall. And we have every 5 years we have a big celebration there, because there were American flyers shot down during the attacks on Taiwan from October till May.
October 44.
October 44 till May of 45. They were shot down, held in the Taipei prison. 14 of these young men some were Navy, some were Army Air Force, were taken to the Japanese military court, given a mock trial with no witnesses, no defense at all, pronounced guilty. And on the 19th of June of 45, they were taken into the courtyard in the prison, and they were murdered by the Japanese firing squad. And so every 5 years we have a big event to celebrate that. And this year, of course, it's the 75th, and we're planning another event and hopefully on the 20th, although it's a work day. We're hoping to get a good crowd. And we'll be going inside the Changhua Telecom complex to see where the actual murders took place.
And that event will be proceeding even with the virus situation, social distancing.
And next Monday, there'll be we're going to have a small Memorial Day service, as we try to do every year as well, for the American community here.
Michael, we don't have much time left, so tell us where on the internet people can find more information about the Taiwan POW Memorial Camp Society.
Okay, our website is www. and then POW Taiwan, all one word, .org. And we have a contact page there, and you can contact us with questions and anything that you might want to ask about or whatever. We'll try to help you as much as we can.
And there's information on the upcoming events.
Yeah, there is as they come up. Yeah, there will be. Yeah, okay. There is. Yeah.
Well, terrific. Thank you for sharing this important information with us. We were joined today by Michael Hurst of the Taiwan POW Memorial Camp Society. Michael, thank you again for coming to the show.
No, thank you very much, Ross, for having me. It's a great pleasure.
I'm Ross Feingold, and you've been listening to Residence Messenger program on Taipei Broadcasting Station. Have a good weekend.